Greetings and welcome to Lobes and Robes, How Neuroscience Can Change the World. This podcast is sponsored by the American University Center for Neuroscience and Behavior and explores the links between neuroscience and key policy questions today. I'm Susan Carl, a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, and I will help lead discussions throughout our series along with Dr. Terry Davidson, Director of the Center for Neuroscience and Behavior at American University and a distinguished professor of neuroscience here. This podcast is for anyone interested in how scientific discovery can make the world a better place. Thanks for listening. I'm very pleased to introduce today my longtime colleague, Louis Grossman, who is a professor of law at American University Washington College of Law, where he specializes in food and drug law, among other subjects. He's also a PhD legal historian, and he's just published a fascinating new book on freedom in medical decisions, which is called Choose Your Own Medicine, and is with Oxford University Press. That's not going to be the primary subject of this podcast episode, but I'm sure some of its themes will come up as we talk to Louis about regulation in the area of food and drug law. He will be speaking with Dr. Terry Davidson, who presented in our last episode his research on obesity and its effects on the brain. And before we start, we also want to disclose that Louis has an of-counsel position at the law firm of Covington and Burling, which is a leading law firm practicing in the area of food and drug law. So hi, Louis. We're so excited to have you here. And we wanted to invite you here to talk primarily about Dr. Davidson's work on neuroscience and diet, though I'm sure we're going to have a much more wide-ranging discussion than that. So maybe we can start with Terry summarizing some of the key findings of his work as they relate, especially to policy questions. We want to try to explore that intersection between his neuroscience work and how to think about connections between health science, policy, and law. Terry, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, I want to say that welcome, Louis. I'm very interested in the kind of work you do, and I've had a chance to look at your book. Haven't been all the way through it, but I'm planning on doing that. I think it's a very interesting book. With respect to my own research, I want to point out that what I really want to talk about is my work as an example of a lot of work that's going on that is health related, has health implications, but it's kind of basic science work. And so one of the things that I was always interested in is how basic science will get translated, how it can have impact outside of academia. Quite often, scientists tend to talk to themselves a lot, but in order to really have an impact in terms of disease, we have to be able to reach people outside. And you're one of the folks, I think, who knows something about that. My own work is focused on the effects of diet on brain, in particular areas of the brain that have been involved in memory. And I think some years ago, we discovered that when we put rats on a diet that was high in fat and sugar, and we tried to make it approximate what is known as the Western diet, which is prevailing in Western societies. It got its start here in the United States, and now it's going all over the world. One of the things we saw is that animals, of course, like people, gain weight on that diet, but they also start showing memory impairments. And one thing we also found that was quite interesting is we have special tests to assess how the animals can use their internal states, like their hunger states, their satiety states, how they're able to detect and use them. And what we found is that the animals were impaired that ate these diets. They were maintained in this kind of diet. They were impaired in using those cues, which made it more difficult than for them to control their intake, because the idea is we rely on, say, signals of satiation to tell us when to stop eating. These guys were not able to use those cues as well. It turns out humans show the same kind of thing if they have damage to the area that we're studying. And then we have other, since we began this work, other laboratories and have advanced it even further. And we have now colleagues in Australia and other places that are examining the implications of the work for humans as well. And so that's just a little bit of the background of what we do. I'm happy to answer any more questions you have, but mostly I'm interested in, so if we have a set of findings, and I think that these findings, I should say, if an animal can't determine whether it's hungry or not, they tend to overeat. And so it seems to me it would have implications for human health and well-being. How does that kind of stuff get translated? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or not.
Well, hi. So thank you for having me, by the way. How does it get translated? So we're talking about one of the core areas of FDA responsibility, which is food regulation. And it regulates both food labeling and food safety, which we will have something to talk about. We will be able to talk about both today, I'm sure. But when you're talking about a particular widely available macronutrient like sugar or fat, there's always going to be a big presumption from a regulatory perspective against FDA regulation of that from the perspective of banning or limiting it as opposed to labeling it. And the general structure, just for our listeners, is that any component of food is potentially something called a food additive. And if it is a food additive, then it needs FDA approval in order to be in the food supply. But there is an enormous exception that swallows up the rule called generally recognized as safe. And all of the big sugar, fat, salt things, as well as other basic ingredients like wheat and rye and rice and everything, are generally presumed to be generally recognized as safe. And to add to that, there is an added presumption of safety, and presumption may not be the right word, but it is easier to demonstrate that you are generally recognized as safe if you are a substance that was common in the food supply before 1958, which was the year that the FDA, that Congress passed the Food Additives Amendments. So therefore, the starting point for things like sugar and fat are that they are generally recognized as safe. So the one big example in recent years of a substance like this actually being removed from the market was trans fats, which FDA declared to be not generally recognized as safe some years ago. And we can talk a lot about that because it's a very interesting story of regulation, where first they took a labeling approach and then went to the additional step of actually banning trans fat from the food supply.
So with respect to trans fat, if I remember right, it was supposed to be something that was healthy for us, and then it turned out not so healthy. And so they decided it was not safe. Who makes the decision?
And let me say, by the way, that the number of times that I ate margarine in the 1970s because my mother said it was safer than or healthier than butter, I just regret those years tremendously right now.
There's a lot of people who are in the same boat as you. Yeah. So I guess this notion of safety. For many years, people have known that excess sugar and fats have harmful effects on physically, heart disease, and a number of different cancers are associated with these kinds of things. how does this translate to being safe? Is it that the data are not convincing enough, or is it there's something else going on?
Well, in general, when the FDA is assessing the safety of a food, animal studies are, or a food substance or food additive, animal studies are incredibly important to that. But they tend to be focusing, first of all, when it comes to cancer, we're talking about a completely different world because there's something called the Delaney Clause, which says that FDA should not approve for use any food substance that has been shown to cause cancer in man or other animals. And read broadly, that has certainly kept many synthetic substances and other substances out of the diet. But if that were applied to common foodstuffs, that would be a revolutionary thing and obviously a very controversial thing, because there are many common foodstuffs that are associated with cancer. When it comes to other types of harm, then the general legal standard is reasonable certainty of no harm. And FDA is much better and much more willing at assessing more acute safety issues than chronic safety issues when it is determining whether or not components of food should be permitted in the food supply. And so they will do rodent studies and larger mammal studies and find the highest no effect dose and so forth. But translating, and you can educate me on this, translating toxicity from an animal study to a human is one thing. Translating lifelong risks of chronic disease from a rodent study to a human study seems to me, although I could be corrected, a much more challenging thing to do.
Oh, it is much more challenging. So, for example, in rodent studies, we can control the diet of an animal to be, one group is going to be getting a placebo and the other group is not. You don't have experiments like that, nor should we, with humans, where we perhaps expose a human to a risky diet and then compare what those effects are to someone who's not on that diet. So most of the data with humans is correlational. And I think correlation is not causation, and the cigarette industry had, banked on that for many, many years. So you're right, it is more difficult. However, the correlations are very strong, and the types of pathophysiology that are produced by certain kinds of diets it's pretty clear. I guess the problem is perhaps it's the quantity that we eat. So they say virtue lies between two extremes, and that may be true with sugar and with fat. At the same time, though, high fat, high sugar products are being marketed like crazy, and so that's an issue that's also of concern, because those are the more unhealthy types of foods are the ones that seem to be being pushed on a lot of people.
And Terry, if I can just clarify one thing, because the discussion we've had so far may lead listeners to conclude that the presence or absence of a food ingredient in the food supply is an on-off switch. Yeah. When in fact, FDA, whether you're talking about its food additive approval process or its GRAS process, has a much more nuanced level of power. It can control quantities, it can control host foods, and it does those things all the time. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah.
Louis, I was thinking about that too, because I don't think Terry's research suggests in any way that sugar and fat should be banned altogether as food substances. It seems to me that it would be impossible to do that, and it wouldn't be the best outcome anyway. But how could the FDA regulate based on findings like Dr. Davidson's that too much of these substances is a very bad thing?
So Certainly. I mean, FDA is a public education agency as well as a regulatory agency. So let's start with that. But let's imagine that the science became indisputable. What could FDA do? Well, let's go back to that. In addition to education, FDA regulates labeling and FDA regulates safety of food. And I imagine that the first approach it would take would be a labeling approach. That's what it did with trans fat when it started to require that trans fat be declared on the nutrition facts label. And what you saw when that was mandated is dropping levels of hydrogenated fats in the American food supply to the point when they ultimately said that trans fat is not generally recognized as safe. It was not such a shock to the system, the food system as a whole and the industrial system as it otherwise would have been. Now let's take sugars. There has been action taken with respect to added sugars. A few years ago, FDA revised its regulations regarding the nutrition facts label and required the declaration of the amount of added sugars in processed foods. And I say processed foods because raw seafood and raw fruits and vegetables aren't going to have added sugar, and they don't have labels stuck to them anyway. And I think it's too early to talk about whether that's having a practical effect on the amount of sugar that's being put into American food. I think that it went fully into effect for large food producers in 2020 and small food producers in 2021. I'm not positive about those dates, but will it have an impact on the composition of American food? Now, when it came to trans fat, the food manufacturers had to come up with alternative ways to make the foodstuffs that people want, and they did that. Indeed, margarine is obviously still on the market, and it has zero trans fats in it, as the last time I checked the label. Of course, people are still going to want sweet things, and people are still going to want fatty things. And so then the question turns into, what are you going to substitute the sugar with? And one thing you can substitute it with potentially is artificial sweeteners of various kinds, or manipulated sugar. And there's all kinds of food research going on. And I'd be interested, Terry, based on your research, what are your views on artificial sweeteners?
You were implying, it seemed to me, that the labeling strategies, they were having some positive effect. And it's more than a labeling strategy for trans fat, right? It was kind of a prohibition.
To be clear, it started as a labeling strategy, and then the industry responded to that labeling strategy by reformulating its foods and pushed the levels of trans fats down near zero. And then when they did say that trans fats were not generally recognized as safe, it wasn't as dramatic a intervention as it would have been if they'd started with that. Now, with added sugars, FDA several years ago started requiring the declaration of added sugars on labels. Now, I assume that FDA's goal there is both to inform consumers about the amount of added sugar, and combined with education, encourage consumers to avoid foods with too much added sugar. But I assume that FDA also hopes that this declaration will have an effect on how American food producers manufacture their food and how much sugar is in it. And it's simply too early to tell whether it will have that effect or not.
There are some people then that we were kind of skeptical about the effectiveness of education campaigns.
Right. And so this steers us to the big, profound question that we should talk about, which is the limits of law in some areas, and whether or not you, as a scientist, or me, as a lawyer and historian, think that there's anything that the law can do in this area. And, there have been very successful public health campaigns in history. Take seatbelts. Nobody used them. Then there was education. Then there were mandates. And now most people use them. Cigarettes are another story where you're actually talking about an addictive substance. And yet the amount of cigarette use in this country is, I believe, much lower than it used to be. I wonder whether, Terry, you think that the cigarette story has any lessons for this story.
So one of the things I remember, Lewis, is that when I was younger, I smoked back a long time ago. I quit smoking many years ago. But I remember paying 25 cents a pack for cigarettes. I don't know what they cost today, but I believe they're in the $3 or $4 range, if not more. And I believe a lot of that is taxes. And so one reason I think that you might be able to, how should I say, reduce the likelihood that people will start and reduce the likelihood that they'll continue is by making it more costly for them. And so that would seem to be a legal thing, right?
Yes, obviously tax policy is a legal thing. But you also have to take into account political reality. And in all likelihood, any taxes like that would be imposed at the municipal or state level. And I think we can agree that there's many states in the country where if there was any kind of tax that could be labeled by opponents or characterized by opponents as a tax on food you like, it's going to have a big uphill climb to get through any state legislature. Not every state legislature, but any. I will mention that New York City did have a ban at one point on beverages of more than sugary beverages, soda and other sugary beverages of more than 16 ounces. And that ended up getting overturned. Interestingly, it was not overturned on any constitutional principle, but on an administrative law principle, whether or not it was the New York court that said that under New York law, that Mayor Bloomberg didn't have the authority to do it.
Yeah, that reminds me of, so your book talks a lot about medical liberty and with respect to vaccinations and drugs and so on. I guess it applies to foods as well. Diet liberty,
yes,
perhaps.
No. There is a long tradition of food libertarianism in this country. And also, of course, there's that in-between territory, which is dietary supplements. And there is a very long history of activism resisting regulation of dietary supplements. But that being said, when it came to cigarettes, maybe tax policy had something to do with it. But I think just a generalized understanding that smoking was bad for you also had something to do with it, probably a large part to do with it. And so, again, looking at the three-pronged approach, education, labeling, which actually is partly education, and the regulation of the substance of foods, if you take the added sugar situation, I think that we're having a combination of education and labeling now, and I think I may have said this before, but the added sugar declaration is just going into effect now, and so we don't know yet whether it will have an effect on how makers of food in America compose their foods. In the trans fat situation, it had an effect. It did not have an effect here. And Terry, I want to raise one other thing if we're just talking about common behaviors. When I was a little kid in the early 1970s, there was a story in the New York Times, I have to assume because that's what my parents read, saying that sugar cereals were really bad for you. It was around 1971, 72. From that day on, a sugar cereal never crossed the transom of my house. So no more Frosted Flakes. So how did my house work for breakfast? Cornflakes with a bowl of sugar and a spoon and me dumping sugar all over the cornflakes.
No, I think that probably repeated in a lot of places. Yeah. I have a question. And so, with respect to FDA, there's been a lot of, I don't know if it's scuttlebutt or conspiracy or whatever, but a lot of concern that the pharmaceutical industry has too much say over decisions that the FDA makes. Should there be concerns about the food industry's influence on the FDA or not?
So I always come around to really defending the integrity of the career scientists and regulators at FDA. This is just based on instinct and having met these people more than anything else. But if the food industry has what might be deemed to be a over large impact on FDA regulation, I don't think, the one thing I want to do is I don't think it has anything to do with the integrity of the career scientists and regulators at FDA for the most part. So then you have to ask questions like, well, is there an oversized influence at the level of the leadership of FDA, political leadership of FDA? And, I have a hard time believing that because there's never, the commissioners have always been medical professionals, MDs, a veterinarian in one instance, with no particular ties to the food industry. So then you have to look at the leadership of the Center for Food Science and Nutrition. And if you just look at the people who have led that agency, that division, again, I think if we're talking about industry influence, what I want to get out of the way right from the start is there's some kind of corrupt pay for play going on at the FDA. It would be a much more indirect cultural influence than anything else. So some people think that there's too much rotation between industry and regulators, and that regulators' decisions may be unconsciously or in some instances consciously affected by the fact that they might be able to have a job in the food industry after they work for the government. There's also various other subtle components, like when you put together a committee of experts at FDA, and this sometimes happens in the food area, it is almost impossible to find experts in the food and nutrition area that don't have some kind of arguable conflict in terms of having gotten industry funding for a study or been a consultant for industry. So that's another thing that some people focus on. And there are conflict of interest rules, but there's also a waiver procedure. And that waiver procedure often has to be used simply in order to staff such committees. I will say, by the way, that those committees are not nearly as important in the food area as in the drug area. But finally, there's Congress. And the FDA can't do anything that Congress won't let it do. And so, for example, in the 1970s, FDA, following the law as it was written, banned saccharin, artificial sugar. And Congress stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. That's also happened with respect to an attempt to more aggressively regulate dietary supplements in the early 1990s. And so when it comes to dramatic regulation, FDA is operating in an environment where it knows that Congress can come in and put a stop to anything that it wants to.
Well, thank you for that answer. It's very it's complete and reassuring. You brought up the saccharin notion. So one way that I think the food industry can have an impact on science is, they tend to have their own scientists. And if you remember the institute, I think there was a tobacco institute or something that was funded by the tobacco industry that had their own scientists. And typically what these folks tend to do, I think, is they emphasize counter research, or they try to identify problems that are in the research that may go against their interests. We had a study that, as a matter of fact, that's been replicated, where saccharin would actually lead to animals' ability. It would reduce their ability to detect real sugars, or the calories, anticipate the calories in real sugars if they had a lot of exposure to saccharin. And nobody eats just saccharin. Of course, we all eat sugars. And this generated not anything governmental, but we ended up like in the sights of the industry's PR apparatus. And that apparatus is fairly large, and scientists tend not to have such a large apparatus. So the reason I'm mentioning this is that the industry has other ways, of course, of making it, assuring their interests. Let me put it that way.
So it seems to me that there's not anything notorious going on, but that when you have some interests that have a lot of funding and a lot of resources, their voices and ability to bring considerations to the attention of regulators is very strong compared to those who don't have all of those resources. And it ends up being sort of an uneven playing field where certain ideas and certain considerations get a lot more play than others.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. And I'm not naive. I know that industry has a lot of power. It certainly has a tremendous amount of power over Congress. And then it has a lot of indirect power and sometimes direct power over regulatory decision making. So I'm not going to deny that, but I will also say that there are some very, very effective public interest organizations like Center for Science in the Public Interest, which can have a tremendous impact on food regulation. For example, there was a fake fat called Olestra, which you may remember, which that was a Procter & Gamble product. It turned out to be an enormous bust. And I don't even think it's available except as an industrial lubricant in the United States today. But the Center for Science and Public Interest also has a megaphone and also has an ability to talk to FDA. And in that situation, they required that a label regarding gastrointestinal effects be put right on the package of any food containing Olestra. And so I think that there is a somewhat healthy debate that goes on at the level of the Food and Drug Administration. But there is no doubt that the law has been written in a way that in certain ways favors industry. So, for example, the entire generally recognized as safe system allows, for example, self-declarations of generally recognized as safe status, in which case FDA doesn't even necessarily know that the food is, or the food substance is out there. Now, Congress could rewrite the law and require some kind of pre-market notification or approval for the GRAS process, but it hasn't done so, and I don't think it's going to do so. Now, there are ways for citizens to get involved in the process. So, for example, the Center for Science in the Public Interest has filed a petition at FDA asking it to declare, I'm not aware of the complete details of this, but to declare added sugars above a certain amount as not generally recognized as safe. The problem is that FDA there's no compulsion for FDA to act on that petition whatsoever.
So you are suggesting that if citizens organize, things might get better, but I doubt that that's something that will happen since the interests are too diffuse, perhaps?
Right. And, and some people argue that, another source of industry power is the fact that they get to fund so much of the research that's actually done in this area. And, maybe, Terry, can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure.
So the atmosphere of industry funding in which you work and the ability of colleagues of yours to maintain their scientific integrity no matter where the money is coming from.
So actually, I can speak a little bit to that. I know that there are a number of universities that will have corporate sponsor panels or groups, and so they may have a number of different food industry representatives, various companies that will pay money to the say a particular department, maybe a nutrition department, for example, to support their research. And the idea is there's no strings attached. And clearly, I don't think many departments no one, I hope, would take money with the notion that you have to produce a particular kind of outcome. I think the danger is, and a lot of my colleagues, so personally, I was once offered help from a major company, and I wouldn't be able to take it. I couldn't take it, even though there were so-called no strings attached, because it's kind of like I've seen where if a researcher produces data that go against the company's interest, the company can simply stop the funding. And what that means is that you have people on your staff, you have people who are relying on that money. Now, I don't think that this is going to make anyone change any data, but I think it's a pressure. It's a pressure that's put on scientists who are taking money from industry that it's going to impact more than their data. And so that kind of pressure, I think, it just makes the situation more complicated. And so a lot of people I know, some people live off of it. Other people will not touch it at all. We'll if we need to have funding, we'll go through National Institutes of Health or NSF or a National Science Foundation or other kind of independent foundations. So I think there's certainly ways that they can have influence on knowledge producers, and when money comes involved, the fact that you might lose it, I think, could have effect that may make, how should I say, certain types of data, maybe it gets held longer, or maybe it gets looked at more carefully, other than if the money wasn't involved. I'll add one. But
Terry, would you say that there's enough public funding of food nutrition research so that you have a rich overall ecosystem rather than one that's completely biased in one direction?
Well, I won't say it's completely biased in one direction, but if you ask a researcher if there's enough money from NIH or whatever, typically the answer is no. It's very, very competitive. So it's in many of the agencies less than 10%, or in some cases maybe a little higher than that, maybe 15%. But a small percentage of the grants are actually getting funded, and some of those grants, of course, are going to be grants on very big ticket items. So it's very competitive for funding, and so I think that makes outside funding from industry more attractive.
When it came to trans fat, what happened is that the food industry came up with different recipes for their food, basically. As I understand it, the creamy filling in Oreo used to be Crisco and sugar. We still have Oreos. We still have roughly the same, tasting thing, but now they use some kind of non-hydrogenated fat to do it. If we were to, by fiat, restrict the amount of fat and or sugar in the food supply, the food industry, which is obviously profit motivated, will do everything it can to have people continue to eat and enjoy its products. And that may mean, in a highly technological food world, artificial fats and artificial sweeteners. And there's all kinds of stuff going on in that area. There's a new fat, I forget what it's called, which is apparently a Lestra without its side effects. And there are people doing all kinds of, work at the molecular level on sugar. And this would be the almost inevitable response to it. And I'm wondering what you feel about that likely response.
Well, so I'm speculating here, at least in part, and that is that I think anytime. So we have a biological system that's not used to artificial kinds of things. This is not, it's not saying that everything artificial is bad. However, typically, so I mentioned artificial sweeteners. I think there's quite a bit of data indicating that artificial sweeteners can kind of trick the body into not being able to assess properly the amount of real sugar or the amount of calories that are in something sweet. And without that kind of information, it could be, and there's some evidence that indicate this, that what happens is that we tend to overeat calories because we're not getting the type of signals that would tell us, we're typically if we get a lot of exposure to something sweet with no calories, it makes us less likely to be able to detect calories in something that really is sweet that really has them. And so all I'm mentioning is that there are going to be counter reactions. And I think it's very important then, before we would mass distribute some type of substitutes for sugar, that we understand what those reactions would be. And that will certainly take a lot of work.
And you would say the same thing for fat, I assume. I mean, not the exact same science. But...
Yes. So I do think that fats, from what we can tell, the most dangerous types of fats are saturated fats. And so a substitution of saturated fats. And again, one of the things you mentioned before, and I tried to mention too, virtualize between two extremes. So it's not so much that you're not going to cut fat out, as Susan said. We're not going to cut sugars out. We have to eat something. But the idea is that can we reduce the content? And can we make it so that people somehow help people reduce the content? Because people on their own are having a lot of difficulty. I will add that some of the work we do suggests that the brain's changing in ways that makes the ability to inhibit eating those kinds of things more difficult. And I think that the idea would be perhaps we could go to healthier fats. I don't know if there are such things as healthier sugars, but there are certainly healthier fats. And then perhaps find ways that we could help people reduce overall intake.
How about the problem of possible differential reaction of different people or populations to different nutrients? And so, for example, I see that salt isn't part of your research. Is that right? You're not doing.
Yeah, I'm not looking. This is not an application of lots of salt, but that's just that we don't study it. Yeah,
right. But the last I checked, there are some people that are salt sensitive and others that aren't salt sensitive. And we're entering an age of personalized medicine. I wonder if we're also entering an age of personalized diet control. And that perhaps people within a few years will be receiving genetic profiles of themselves and being told that both with respect to satiation and health, that this is the type of diet you should be eating. Do you see a future like that?
So I think that's very interesting, and so it is the case that I can harp on saturated fats and I can harp on sugars, and there are some folks who aren't really responsive to that, so they can control their intake of those things. They don't, there are different people. I say sometimes in my classes that someone can basically eat all the fats and sugars they want, and a lot of us will look at them with envy because they don't seem to gain weight. And yet other folks, if even thinking about it, seems to put weight on. So there's certainly differences there. It's got to be based. Certainly genetics are involved in this, and perhaps some life experiences which impact on how people utilize the food, or their body utilizes the food. And I think it'd be really important then to try to understand those things. And what you're talking about there is kind of individualized. Now, again, there may be kind of general rules that can apply to broad swaths of people, and we may be able to categorize people in terms of their sensitivity, these kinds of things. But yeah, I actually think that what you're talking about there is very interesting kind of prospect for science.
Yes, I've always felt personally that I get a particularly high level of satiation from a type of food that it creates a regulatory problem. Because as we've seen in just during the pandemic, there's a large group of Americans who aren't really willing to abide by things that will help Americans at a population level if it will impact them negatively, either physically or emotionally, as individuals. And as soon as the science becomes clear, if it does become clear that some people react to saturated fat in a certain way and others react in a different way, it becomes all the more challenging for the government to say, we are going to limit saturated fat for everybody, because then you'll have a group of people who can eat French fries all day and not have a negative effect, who will be furious at that.
Well, it's the same thing, though. They used to have advertisements on television for cigarettes, and they usually have somebody's 99-year-old granddad who'd been smoking Camels without filters for 70 years. So I do still think, I do believe there are differences, but I do think there are going to be general effects too, that you could have a positive effect on the health of the population. Just as vaccines, they're not going to be effective or equally effective for everyone, but in general, they are very effective. And for the most part, the majority of people, the great majority, will benefit from them. So I think again, we may be able to fine tune, as you're talking about, and that would be an ideal situation. But I don't know if we should wait until we're able to do that.
I'm glad you brought that up. But I wanted to steer us towards other kinds of policy interventions that are short of outright prohibition. To go back to the cigarettes, for example, an intervention might be making certain products harder to reach, such as putting fatty or sugar-filled products in grocery stores on higher shelves or in the back of the store. In other words, moving them so that they're not the first thing you see. And I can think of other interventions as well, such as funding subsidies for farmers markets or for other kinds of fresh produce displays. Are there other sorts of interventions, such as using Cass Sunstein's nudge theory? Are there other creative ways of thinking about gentle interventions into human behavior that could have good public health consequences?
So, I think I'm not an expert on the science of nudge theory in the food area, but I think that it has had a widespread influence. And sometimes nudges can be labeling. So, for example, I know that FDA has been considering for a long time some kind of front of package labeling. I think it was in Britain where they kind of had a green light, red light, yellow light system or something like that in place for a while. So that's one kind of thing. Some people point out that there are food deserts in in the United States, in the sense of neighborhoods, especially in the disadvantaged parts of major cities, where it's hard to get to a supermarket, but easy to get to a McDonald's. And I don't know how you nudge the supermarket industry into opening more supermarkets in those areas. But even if you do put a supermarket in that area, I can walk out of a supermarket with Frosted Flakes and Twizzlers. And so what Susan is referring to are other nudges kind of within the supermarket. So I know that Coke and Pepsi, from what I've read at least, trade off in supermarkets, having that very prominent place at the head of each aisle on a weekly or monthly basis. And I say this with caution because I don't know the details. Clearly, they think that shelf placement and product placement has an effect on what people buy. Now, this is a choice between Coke and Pepsi, not between soda and fruit juice or something. So in theory, there could be nudges like that, but it's kind of outside my sphere of legal expertise, and I assume that there would be tremendous pushback to that kind of micro regulation of product placement in the supermarket. Another interesting general issue when it comes to obesity, and I'd love to talk about this more too, because it's, to me, a fascinating behavioral economics and regulatory problem, is serving size. So FDA, in the same regulations in which it amended the nutrition facts label to include added sugar, also did a systemic revision of serving sizes. Now, most Americans don't realize this, but the serving sizes that are indicated on every food label that you buy are not an estimate or something by the company. They are dictated by FDA. And so for example, if you take a pint of ice cream, FDA decided that the old serving sizes correlated to studies that came out in the 1970s, and that therefore they were out of date, and that the serving sizes should be amended in order to reflect actual current eating patterns. And so I'm just spitballing here, but let's imagine that a pint of ice cream used to be 3 servings. Now it might be 2 servings. And the interesting question is, what effect is that going to have on consumption patterns? Because one way to think about it is people will look at the label and they'll say, oh my God, a serving of this ice cream has this much saturated fat in it. That's horrific. But another possibility is somebody will look at the label and say, wow, I can eat half of this thing of ice cream and it's only 1 serving. And it's always been curious to me, not curious, fascinating to me as to which of those 2 impacts serving size reform has.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Well, hopefully somebody will be studying that.
I would certainly hope so. But, there was a very, very systematic revision of serving sizes upward just a couple of years ago. And I've always been concerned on a completely uneducated basis that it may be having the reverse effect that it's supposed to.
That's an interesting thing. I do know one thing. It seems like I actually had a conversation with a student yesterday, and the student, we were talking about actually serving size in a restaurant, and the basic idea was, I said, well, you don't have to eat all of it. And that response was, well, I paid for all of it. Right. So if you're paying for it, right. Yeah. It was like, I have to eat all of it if I paid for all of it. And restaurants, of course, I think they sometimes use serving size as a way to attract customers. Louis, I was wondering about so we've talking about incentives, and taxing probably has lots of problems. If I'm gonna tax sugar, people are gonna push against that, and quite often those taxes are regressive taxes, and they hit people who can't afford them. Worse than other kinds of folks. And so, what about the idea of giving incentives? So, the idea of encouraging the food industry to, say, reduce the saturated fats or sugars by giving them incentives to do that. So instead of taxing them, and which they might pass on to the consumer, give them incentives, so tax breaks based on their ability to reduce the fat and sugar in their products.
So I am not a tax expert, but let me tell you my initial instincts. Given how few taxes major corporations are currently paying,
I gotcha.
I don't know how much room there is for incentives. Moreover, I don't know whether in this political environment where there seems to be pretty intense anti-corporatism of certain kinds coming from both the left and the right, I think that even if people think it will advance the public health, there are many people who might also resist it based on the fact that it's a tax break for a major corporation.
Well, we could go on much longer. Louis, this has been really fascinating and exactly what we're hoping we can accomplish through this podcast, which is to get people from different sides of the science policy divide talking to each other. So thank you so much, Louis. This has really been amazing.
Yes, thank you very much, Louis. I appreciate it. I enjoyed. Also, I would recommend anyone who's listening take a look at Louis's book. Louis, do we have any comments or anything to say about that?
So, the title is Choose Your Medicine, Freedom of Therapeutic Choice in America. It is not a policy promoting piece, but rather a history of the idea of therapeutic choice in America and its longtime impact on health policy, law, and regulation. And it's written in a way to be of interest, not just to specialists, but to anybody who likes a good historical story. And I hope many of you will take a look at it. It becomes available in early October.
Yeah, and from what I've seen, it is an interesting historical story and very enlightening, eye-opening.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this podcast episode. Thanks very much for listening. And as always, we welcome your feedback at neuroscience.policy@american.edu. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. And do let us know if there's anything in particular you'd like to hear more about.